There's one question no Pentagon official ever answers in a press briefing, not because the answer is classified, but because the answer exposes a contradiction the US government would rather not spell out in public. What happens when an operator from one of the deadliest units in the world ends up in the hands of an ally whose methods America officially condemns, but has unofficially studied, copied, and admired for decades? The Mossad isn't an enemy of Delta Force, it's a partner. The two services have decades of documented cooperation in counter-terror ops, intel sharing, and joint training. Delta operators have been in Israel, Mossad agents have been at Fort Bragg. In the years after 9/11, the Pentagon sent officers to Tel Aviv specifically to learn from Israeli interrogation methods and urban operations. But partners aren't the same thing as blind trust. And in that gap between partner and blind trust lies a scenario the Department of Defense plans for but never talks about. A US operator on an undeclared mission in Israeli territory or sphere of influence with no official cover, no diplomatic credentials grabbed by Shin Bet or Mossad before Washington has time to make a phone call. To understand what happens in that scenario, you first have to understand what sets Mossad apart from every other intel agency Delta Force has ever worked shoulder to shoulder with. Mossad was built on a doctrine the CIA took decades to accept and Delta Force still treats with institutional discomfort. The idea that an agent's identity is never proof of loyalty, that someone carries a US passport, uses US kit, and says they work for the US. Government is, for Mossad counterintelligence analysts, the start of an investigation, not the end. Israel's been burned by allies before. By Jonathan Pollard, a US Navy analyst who sold intel secrets to Israel while pretending to be a patriot. By Soviet agents embedded in their own ranks in the 50s and 60s. By leaks from carefully planned operations that reached the wrong ears often enough to build an institutional culture of systematically verifying everyone, allies included. That culture is the first problem a Delta operator runs into if Mossad takes him. Picture the scene, a Delta operator. Call him a first sergeant of the there aren't many like him kind. 14 years in, 3 rotations in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, a veteran of operations that officially never happened in countries whose names start with letters the State Department would rather not say. He's on an undeclared op. That means no uniform, no military ID, nothing tying his presence to that place and that mission. Commercial cover, private security consultant maybe, or infrastructure engineer. The kind of cover that works against most second-tier intel services. Mossad isn't second-tier. The agents who intercept him know, before they say a word, that he's American, not because the cover failed, but because Israeli signals intel has been watching the pattern of his comms for the last 72 hours, because Mossad has sources in at least 2 of the US agencies Delta works with regularly. Because the footwear, a detail that looks irrelevant, is from a specific manufacturer used exclusively by US Special Operations units in cover environments, and an Israeli analyst who spent 10 years studying US SOF kit recognized the tread pattern before he even saw the operator's face. They take him somewhere that isn't a conventional prison, no cells in sight, no uniformed guards. It's a facility that deliberately looks like a corporate meeting room, table, chairs, bottled water on the table, neutral lighting. The environment is designed to produce a specific state, confusion about what's actually happening. Because when you don't know whether you're being questioned, detained, recruited, or just checked out, your reaction gives away more than any answer to a straight question. The Israeli interrogator across the table doesn't shout, doesn't threaten, doesn't ask the obvious questions. He starts talking about something totally different from what the operator expected. The history of the unit the operator belongs to, operational details that should be classified from any foreign service, allies included. The interrogator drops names, names of other operators, names of missions, names this guy with 14 years in knows nobody outside the right security compartment should know. That's the first moment of psychological collapse, not pain, not deprivation, the collapse that comes from realizing the other side knows more about you than you assumed. This is what Delta's resistance to interrogation training prepares you for, what the US military calls SEER: survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. Adversaries who use sleep deprivation, physical stress, isolation, and threats. Advanced SEER for Tier 1 units like Delta includes extremely realistic simulation scenarios at facilities in places the Department of Defense doesn't disclose publicly, where specialized instructors spend days testing operators' psychological resilience before clearing them for high-risk missions. What SEER doesn't fully prepare an operator for is the interrogator who doesn't need any of that, who has enough information that resistance isn't just hard, it feels pointless. The US protocol in that situation is clear and simple on paper: name, rank, service number. No confirmation of mission, unit, or affiliation with any program that isn't officially acknowledged. No information on capabilities, methods, or personnel. Functional silence. In practice, functional silence against Mossad has a complication the protocol doesn't fix. Mossad doesn't need the operator to confess. They already know enough. The interrogation isn't about getting new information. It's about evaluating whether that operator is what they claim to be, a US ally on mission, or something messier. A double agent? An asset working for a third party under American cover. A US operation Israel wasn't read in on that violates the intel coordination agreements the two countries keep. While that's going on in the room that looks like a corporate meeting room, another conversation happens somewhere else. In Washington, someone on the National Security Council gets a message, not on an official channel, but the kind of channel that exists exactly for situations like that. A short message, a question: do you have an asset operating in Area X? The answer to that question determines everything that happens next. If Washington confirm, and if someone with enough authority dials the right number and says yes, that's our guy, he's on a coordinated mission, the operator is cut loose within hours. No incident, no public paperwork, nothing to suggest anything happened at all. He goes back to the mission or gets exfiltrated, depending on how blown the op is. The two services have a quiet conversation about coordination, and cooperation continues. If Washington doesn't confirm, if the mission was so undeclared that no official channel can be used without exposing it, if the operator was in territory where US presence can't be acknowledged, if the op was planned in a compartment so tight that the people who could confirm can't reach each other in real time, then the operator stays in that corporate-looking room a lot longer. Days, potentially, not because Mossad wants to mess with a US ally, but because, from Israeli counterintelligence's point of view, an American who can't be verified through any US channel is by definition unverified, and an unverified ally gets the same protocols as anyone else who's unverified. That's the central paradox training never fully resolves. The more secret the mission, the less protection the operator has. Delta Force operates at the highest level of US government information compartmentation precisely because its missions are the most sensitive. And that same compartmentation, which protects the mission, makes the operator invisible to the systems that could rescue him. Eric Haney, one of Delta's founding operators, described the philosophy of advanced training like this: you're trained to operate without a safety net because the mission that justifies your existence doesn't have a safety net. Haney wasn't talking about capture by Mossad, but the logic fits with surgical precision. The operator who walks out of that room, when he walks out, doesn't go to any press briefing, doesn't give interviews, doesn't show up in any document. In some cases, his time in the Israeli facility never hits a US file because logging the detention would force explaining the mission, and explaining the mission would force officially confirming what officially never happened. He goes back to Fort Bragg, goes through a security debrief. They ask what he said, what he didn't say, what Mossad asked, and how they asked it. That debrief isn't to punish him, it's to gauge how compromised the operation is and whether the mission can continue or has to be scrubbed. And then at some point, he gets a new assignment, and he ships out again to somewhere that officially doesn't exist, to do something the US government officially doesn't do, in the name of interests the US government officially doesn't have, because that's what Delta Force is, a force that operates in the space between what can be confirmed and what has to be done, a force trained to run without a safety net, without public recognition, and without the kind of protection a soldier in uniform gets automatically. The alliance with Mossad is real, the cooperation is real, but the line between ally and careful observer never fully disappears. Because in the world of intelligence and special operations, trust isn't a permanent state. It's something you have to verify again and again in real time by people who've spent a whole lifetime not believing the first version of any story, yours included. If you want to understand what happens when the CIA finds out one of those checks turns up something nobody expected to find, that video's on screen now. Subscribe if you want to stay inside the compartments the government would rather you never saw.